"Relax, miss. We run this hallway." The words came out like a joke, but they didn't sound funny. They echoed down the lockers, bouncing off the cold metal and the fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. The new teacher kept walking, gripping the folder against her chest a little tighter. One of the boys laughed too loudly, the kind of laugh meant for an audience. The other smirked and stepped closer than anyone should, shoulder brushing hers on purpose. She didn't flinch. Not outside, anyway. Inside, her heartbeat felt like footsteps running across a bridge that suddenly didn't feel sturdy anymore. She had been warned that first weeks at a new school could be tough. But nobody had said anything about this. Nobody had mentioned what it felt like when a line was crossed right in front of everyone else, and how silence could feel like betrayal. "Say something," one of the boys whispered, as if daring her. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Teachers are supposed to be calm, professional, controlled. She reminded herself of that word, control, the way it had once been drilled into her bones on quiet training mats years earlier, in a life that felt far away now. She had promised herself she wouldn't be that person anymore. She had promised to move on, to teach, to bring peace into classrooms. But peace is fragile, especially when someone decides it doesn't matter. A girl down the hall paused, watching. A boy pretended not to see. A janitor turned a corner and then turned back again, like he had forgotten something. The hallway held its breath, and the teacher wondered, not for the first time, how far some people would go when they believed there would never be consequences. Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. The bell rang. The laughter stopped. The moment didn't disappear, though. It stayed like a bruise under the surface. And in that instant, something shifted inside her. Not anger, not revenge, just a quiet realization this wasn't going to fix itself. And whether she liked it or not, the past she had tried to leave behind was suddenly walking beside her again. The day had begun like any other new teacher morning. Too early, too quiet, filled with the smell of coffee and the weight of expectations. She had stared at her reflection longer than necessary, taking in the neat white blouse, the pressed skirt, the pale gold hair she had tied back to look older than she felt. Presentation, she thought. Control the presentation and maybe you can control the day. Her name was Claire Bennett, though she introduced herself simply as Miss Bennett. The name still felt new in this town. Nobody here knew who she had been before, and that was intentional. She'd moved across the state with 2 suitcases, a resume full of recommendations, and a promise she had made quietly to herself: start over, teach, stay small, stay safe. The school building had the familiar scent of cleaner, paper, and something vaguely nostalgic. The scent of years layered on years. Students moved in shifting patterns, waves of colors and backpacks, voices rising and falling like ocean tides. Teachers nodded politely. Some smiled, some didn't. A few seemed curious in the way people are when they sense there's a story behind you, but they don't know whether it's appropriate to ask. She liked the quiet before first bell. The desks arranged in gentle rows, the chalk lines still crisp from yesterday. She stood there for a moment, fingers resting on the edge of the desk, letting herself believe this could work. Then the rumors started to circle. New teacher in Hall C looks strict. She won't last. It wasn't personal, not yet. It was the usual teenage testing of boundaries, the casual way students discuss adults as if they're temporary fixtures. Claire smiled, shrugged internally, and carried on. She had handled worse. She had learned to breathe through discomfort long ago. Her first classes went well enough. There were jokes, tentative questions, a kid in the back who tried to sleep but woke up when she gently tapped the desk. She liked that moment, the way humor diffused tension without humiliation. She believed in that. She believed in respect being modeled, not enforced with fear. By lunch, though, the energy around her had shifted. People whispered when she passed. Not hostile, not kind either. Curious, evaluating. She heard the name Evan and Tyler more than once. Not from teachers, from students. The names carried a tone. Heavy, cautious. The way people talk about storms, big kids with varsity jackets, the kind who had grown up convinced the hallways bent around them like a path. Claire had dealt with confident kids before. Confidence wasn't dangerous. Entitlement, on the other hand, could become something else if nobody ever told it no. She avoided thinking too far ahead. She focused on lesson plans, on remembering names, on building trust. That was the job. That was what mattered. But then, that hallway incident happened. It unfolded in 3 seconds that somehow felt like a minute. She was walking, simply walking, moving from one class to another. She saw the boys before they saw her, laughing with friends, tossing a ball of paper into a locker like it was a hoop. Their jackets were bright, almost theatrical. They were used to being noticed. When their eyes landed on her, something changed in their smiles. One step closer, another. The space around her narrowed. She kept her posture straight, eyes forward, refusing to reward the attention with fear. A hand brushed the air too close. A comment slid out like oil. The world sharpened around the edges. Inside her mind, the training she had buried years ago flickered alive, stance, breath, distance, options. Not to use, never to use, but to calm the rush of adrenaline. Taekwondo for her had never been about hurting anyone. It had been about balance, about not letting fear own the body. She swallowed the words she wanted to say. She chose professionalism. "Keep moving, please," she said instead, voice steady. The boys laughed, not with humor, with power. And for the first time since arriving at this school, Claire felt something dangerously close to doubt, not in herself, but in the environment, in whether adults here confronted things or simply endured them. She wondered how many teachers had walked this same hallway pretending not to notice. Later, she sat alone at her desk, the room empty, the silence loud. She placed her hands on the table to stop them from shaking. Not shaking from fear, but from the effort it took to contain everything rising inside. "This is a job," she reminded herself. "You are here to teach, to guide, to help. But there are lines." And today, someone stepped over one. She didn't yet know what would come next. She didn't know which choices would matter most. She only knew that the feeling she'd had in that hallway, the sense of injustice casually draped as humor, had followed her into this room and refused to leave. And something in her heart whispered that ignoring it would only invite it back. The next morning arrived with a sky the color of pewter, the clouds hanging low as if they too carried unspoken weight. Claire arrived early again, hoping routine might repair whatever had cracked inside. She checked attendance sheets, arranged papers, drew a small diagram on the board to spark curiosity when students walked in. She told herself, "Today will be different, but schools have memory, just like people do. And sometimes, memory spreads faster than truth." By second period, whispers had become stories. In one version she'd yelled at the boys, in another she had cried. Someone claimed she'd reported them. Someone else insisted she was too scared to say anything at all. Each retelling eroded something real and replaced it with something convenient. When Evan and Tyler walked into her classroom for the first time, the air tightened. They chose seats in the middle where control feels easiest. They leaned back, smiled faintly, not openly hostile, just testing, just waiting. Claire greeted them like everyone else. No special attention, no coldness. She handed out worksheets, guided discussion, praised thoughtful answers. She tried to create an environment that felt predictable, safe. Students responded, even the ones who pretended not to. A few glanced between her and the boys occasionally, as if watching a chessboard. Halfway through class, the pencil tapping started. Tap, tap, tap. Barely noticeable at first, then louder. Claire looked up. "Please keep it down," she said gently. Evan shrugged. Tyler grinned. Tap, tap, tap. She paused her sentence mid-thought, then decided to finish anyway. Giving attention to behavior often feeds it. She'd learned that. But there's a difference between ignoring and allowing someone to broadcast disrespect without challenge. She walked slowly down the aisle, eyes staying soft. "We're all here to learn," she said. "Let's help each other with that." The tapping stopped for a moment. Later, when students worked quietly on an assignment, a folded piece of paper slid across a desk, passed from one hand to another. Claire noticed. She also noticed the way Tyler watched her notice, like he was measuring how far he could push. He met her eyes and smiled. She smiled back, not to agree, but to show she saw him clearly. Inside, that old discipline rose up again. The voice of an instructor long gone. Stay grounded. Respond. Don't react. You cannot control what others do. You can control how you stand. She thought about the promises she'd made to herself years ago, how after a particular tournament, after one injury, one moment that changed how she viewed competition, she had chosen to step away. She didn't miss the combat. She missed the clarity, the certainty that there were rules and consequences and mutual respect. Schools were supposed to be like that too. After class, Evan lingered near the door. Not close enough to be threatening, close enough to be intentional. "So," he said, casually, "how long you planning to stay?" Claire looked at him, studying the bravado that looked more like performance than truth. "Long enough to help people succeed," she said, "including you," he scoffed, uncomfortable with sincerity. "Yeah, okay." He walked off. Tyler followed. When they were gone, something softer flickered through Claire's mind, a question she hadn't allowed herself earlier. Who taught them that this is how power works? Who rewarded it? Who excused it? That didn't absolve them. But it reframed the battlefield. This wasn't simply about bullies and victims. It was about culture, about silence, about the stories young people tell themselves about what strength looks like. After school, Claire sat in the staff room. The coffee tasted burnt. A veteran teacher drifted by, offering a sympathetic half-smile. "They test everyone," she said quietly. "Best thing is not to take it personal." Claire nodded politely, though something inside her disagreed. It wasn't personal, and that was the problem. It was systemic, predictable, and predictably harmful. Walking out to the parking lot, she paused near her car and watched the shadows stretch across the asphalt. A group of students laughed near the bus lane. Evan tossed his backpack into the air and caught it. Tyler slapped him on the back. For a brief second, they looked like kids, not antagonists, just boys trying on personas that didn't quite fit yet. Claire's heart tightened. Complicated emotions rarely fit neatly into good and bad. But later that evening, as she prepared lessons at her kitchen table, her phone screen lit up with a message from a colleague. "Heard you had a rough hallway moment yesterday. If it happens again, let admin know. If." Claire exhaled slowly. She knew what they didn't. It hadn't been a moment. It had been a warning. She closed her eyes and pictured the hallway again, the fluorescent lights, the echo of laughter, the invisible pressure for everyone to pretend nothing was wrong. And somewhere deep in her chest, a seed of resolve began to take root. Not revenge, not punishment, just a simple decision. This school might not know it yet, but something about the way things worked here was about to change. And whether the administration approved or not, silence was no longer going to be part of her lesson plan. By the third week, the rhythm of the school had woven itself into Claire's days. Bells, footsteps, the murmur of conversations between classes, all of it formed a soundtrack, She was slowly learning to live inside. But beneath the routine, there was an undercurrent she could feel more clearly now. Patterns, reactions, avoidances, tiny signals that told a larger truth. Most students respected her. Some began to trust her. A few even lingered after class to ask questions about college applications or essays they couldn't quite finish at home. Those moments filled her with quiet joy. They reminded her why she had chosen this path again after everything. Teaching wasn't about control. It was about doors, opening them, showing students they existed. But there were others, the ones who watched from the corners, calculating, deciding who mattered and who didn't. And among them, Evan and Tyler remained the center of gravity. Not because they were cruel all the time. They weren't. Sometimes they could be funny, even charming, when it suited them. They helped friends carry books, slapped hands in greeting, moved through groups like they belonged everywhere. And that, Claire realized, was the dangerous part. Their presence normalized the way they leaned on people, on rules, on boundaries. It started showing up in smaller ways. A late assignment tossed onto her desk with no apology. A sarcastic remark spoken just loud enough for others to catch. The subtle way they rolled their eyes while she gave instructions, inviting laughter. Not enough to write referrals over, just enough to chip at the edges of respect. Silence became complicity. One afternoon she stood in front of the whiteboard while students copied notes. Evan whispered something across the table. Tyler grinned. A girl looked uncomfortable. Claire saw it happen like a flicker in a storm. She set down the marker and walked over calmly. "Share it with the class," she said, voice steady, not mocking. Evan blinked. Tyler shifted. "It's nothing," Evan muttered. "If it's disrupting learning," she replied, "then it's something." The room went quiet, not fearful, simply attentive. A small balance had shifted and everyone felt it. Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't embarrass him. She simply refused to pretend the moment didn't exist. After a beat, Evan shrugged. "I'm good." "Then let's get back to work," she said softly. They did, and for a little while it felt like progress. But progress often irritates people who are used to their version of control. After school that day, Claire stepped outside to find the parking lot damp from a brief rain. The air smelled metallic, like wet pavement. She reached for her keys and noticed something taped to her windshield. A scrap of notebook paper. It read, "Lighten up." No signature, no threat. Just two words, casual and dismissive, like a joke someone thinks you should get. She removed the note, folded it slowly, and slipped it into her bag. That night, she sat on her couch with the TV off, listening to the quiet apartment settle. Memories surfaced uninvited. Her old instructor's voice, the echo of bare feet on wooden floors, the controlled breathing before stepping onto a mat. She remembered the discipline, the self-awareness, the calm. And she remembered the lesson that had stayed with her more than any other. You cannot always choose what people do to you, but you can choose what you allow to define you. She was not going to be defined by fear, or by the boys who wanted to make her smaller in order to feel bigger. But she also wasn't going to let anger lead. Anger narrows vision. She needed clarity. The next day in class, she changed her approach slightly. More collaborative projects, more discussion circles, clearer boundaries explained, not as punishment, but as structure designed to protect everyone's ability to learn. Students responded with curiosity. Even some of the quieter ones spoke up. During one particularly thoughtful conversation about consequences and choices in literature, Claire noticed Evan listening more than usual. His posture softened. For a few minutes, the mask slipped, and she saw the flicker of someone who might actually be tired of playing his role. Then the bell rang and the mask returned with a snap. In the hallway afterward, Claire heard laughter again, sharp, performative. A backpack shoved a little too hard against another student's shoulder. A comment muttered under breath. Little things, but little things accumulate until they aren't little anymore. She paused mid-stride and leaned briefly against the cool metal of a locker. A thought landed in her mind with uncomfortable precision. If nobody models courage here, the cycle will continue. Not dramatic courage, not confrontational bravado. The quieter kind. The kind that says, I see what's happening, and I will not pretend it's fine. That evening she sat with the folded note on her kitchen table. Lighten up. A message disguised as humor, carrying the weight of expectation. She smiled faintly, not because it was funny, but because it revealed something important. They wanted her to play along, and she had already decided she wouldn't. The fourth week brought a new kind of tension. Heavier, less playful, like the air before a storm. Claire felt it the way one feels static gathering on skin. Students looked around more. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Something had shifted beneath the surface, and she couldn't quite name it yet. The guidance counselor approached her in the staff lounge one morning with a gentle tone. "How are you adjusting?" she asked. Claire offered an honest but measured answer. "I'm learning the rhythms, and I'm noticing a few pressure points." The counselor nodded slowly, as if she understood more than she could say aloud. "This place has history. Some things take persistence. You're doing fine." Fine. A word that both comforts and avoids. Later that day, during lunch duty in the hallway, Claire stood near the lockers, monitoring the flow of students. Evan and Tyler leaned against the wall a few yards away, surrounded by friends. Their laughter rose and fell. They glanced at her occasionally with curiosity, as if trying to understand why she didn't react the way others did. At one point, a smaller boy dropped his tray. Food scattered across the floor. The noise drew attention immediately. People laughed. The boy bent down, cheeks burning. Before Claire could move, Evan stepped forward, and for a moment she tensed, unsure of what he would do. He picked up the milk carton and placed it on the tray. "Relax," he said to the boy. "Happens." Then he smirked at his friends, soaking in their approval. Claire watched closely. It wasn't kindness, it was theater, a performance of benevolence meant to reinforce power. I decide when to humiliate and when to spare. But still, a crack appeared in the narrative she'd been building about him. Nothing about this situation was simple. After lunch, she met with the assistant principal to discuss curriculum updates. The conversation was friendly but brisk. She debated mentioning the ongoing hallway issues, the note on her car, the subtle tests, but the moment never quite presented itself. The office buzzed with calls, meetings, paperwork. Everyone seemed busy putting out larger fires. Walking back to her classroom, she caught fragments of conversation from two teachers passing by. "They're good kids," one said, "just need structure." "They get away with too much," the other replied. "Everyone knows it." Claire absorbed both perspectives, filing them away. Structure without accountability becomes permission. Accountability without empathy becomes cruelty. The balance mattered. That afternoon, during group work, something small but significant happened. A disagreement broke out at one table. Voices rose. Claire approached calmly. "What's going on?" she asked. A girl pointed at Tyler. "He keeps taking over." Tyler leaned back, hands behind his head. "I'm just trying to help. They're slow." Claire crouched slightly to meet his eye level. "Leadership isn't about volume," she said gently. "It's about making space for others." The room stilled. Tyler rolled his eyes, but there was a flicker, irritation, defensiveness, maybe even confusion. Claire didn't press. She let the words land and moved on. After class, as students filtered out, Evan lingered again. He hesitated, looked at the floor, then back at her. "You used to do something," he said suddenly, "like sports or whatever." Claire blinked, surprised. "Why do you think that?" He shrugged. "The way you stand, like you're ready." She held his gaze. "I used to train," she said simply. "At what?" "Something that taught me discipline. He nodded slowly as if storing the information away. He left without another word. Later, the moment replayed in Claire's mind, ready. The word echoed. She hadn't realized the discipline in her posture was still visible. She hadn't intended to reveal anything, but perhaps that small truth mattered. That evening, she drove home while the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and lavender. She thought about students whose lives extended far beyond the lockers and classrooms. She thought about Evan and Tyler in particular, boys with confidence that looked like armor. She wondered what lay beneath it: expectations, pressure, fear. She didn't excuse their behavior, but she understood that if she only saw them as villains, she would miss the chance to change anything. At home, she stretched on the living room rug, moving through quiet exercises she hadn't done in years. Her muscles remembered, her breath slowed. Balance returned to her body in a way that surprised her, not as adrenaline but as stillness. She wasn't training to fight. She was training to stay grounded when the world tried to tilt. The next day, a subtle test emerged again. During dismissal, someone jostled her shoulder deliberately. Not violently, just enough. Laughter trailed behind. She turned, met their eyes, and said calmly, "We respect space here." The laughter faded. A few students exchanged looks. A few seemed relieved. As she walked toward the exit, she realized something important. The power imbalance wasn't just between her and the boys. It was between the boys and the entire environment that had learned to live with behavior that crossed lines. That understanding didn't make things easier, but it gave her direction. She would not shout. She would not shame. She would not turn this into a spectacle. Instead, she would do what she had always done when facing opponents bigger or louder than herself. She would outlast them. And sooner or later, the story everyone thought they knew about who controlled this hallway was going to change. Not with noise, but with unwavering, patient strength. By the time October crept in, the crispness in the air matched the quiet firmness that had begun to take root inside Claire. She wasn't naive. She knew the situation wasn't improving simply because no major incidents had been reported. In schools like this, the real stories lived beneath the surface, in glances, in whispered comments, in choices about who got included and who didn't. The administration loved data. The charts said discipline referrals were low. The spreadsheets suggested things were stable, but stability can sometimes mask a slow erosion. A culture that forgives small cruelties eventually learns to excuse bigger ones. One Monday morning, Claire entered her classroom early and noticed something new. Someone had drawn a small caricature on the corner of the whiteboard. Blonde hair, a stern expression. The stick figure had oversized glasses and an exaggerated frown. Beneath it, someone had written, "The Ice Queen." She stood in front of it for a moment, considering. It wasn't explicit disrespect, it was dismissive humor, the kind that pretends to be harmless. She felt a pang, not of anger, but of sadness. People make jokes about what they fear or don't understand. When students entered, a few froze. One boy looked at the drawing, then at her, waiting to see how she would respond. Claire picked up the eraser, but instead of wiping it away, she paused. "I never like seeing people labeled," she said gently, "because labels shrink a person into one quality, and people are always more complicated than that." She erased it slowly. The room felt different for a moment. Not embarrassed, but thoughtful. Claire didn't mention it again. She didn't chase the culprit. Instead, she redirected the class into a discussion about identity and literature. How do stories trap characters into roles? How do characters challenge those roles? Halfway through the conversation, something important happened. A quiet student named Rosa raised her hand and said softly, "Sometimes people think strength looks like being loud, but I think sometimes strength is being calm." Claire smiled, not outwardly triumphant, just deeply grateful. The class nodded. Even Tyler looked away, unsettled by the clarity of the comment. After school, Claire carried stacks of papers to her car. As she placed them on the passenger seat, she noticed a different note tucked carefully under her windshield wiper. Her chest tightened, but when she unfolded it, the words surprised her. "Thanks for today. Someone in your class, no name, no explanation, just a message that said, in its own small way, keep going." That evening, Claire drove to a community center on the edge of town. She didn't plan to train, not fully, but there was a class she had heard about, focused on mindfulness and controlled movement. She wanted to reconnect to the discipline without returning to the world of competition. The gym smelled faintly of mats and disinfectant. The instructor, a calm woman in her 50s, welcomed her without question. The session focused on breathing, balance, and intention. No sparring, no ego, only alignment. Standing in silence, Claire felt something unfurl inside, tension she hadn't realized she had been carrying. She remembered what real strength had always meant to her: clarity under pressure, compassion without surrender, the courage to choose response over reaction. When the session ended, the instructor said quietly, "You carry yourself like someone who's had to stand in storms." Claire smiled softly. "I teach," she said. The instructor laughed knowingly. "Ah, that explains everything." Driving home under the glow of streetlights, Claire realized something had shifted. She wasn't trying to survive her job anymore. She was preparing herself to influence it, not with force, but with consistency, with modeling, with boundaries delivered without apology. But change, she knew, never arrives without resistance. And somewhere, at that same moment, two boys sat at a diner booth, planning a joke they believed would remind everyone of where the power really was. They didn't understand yet that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one most prepared for the moment when quiet alone is no longer enough. The joke arrived 2 days later, wrapped in laughter. It started with a rumor that spread through the halls like wind. Someone had made a fake account, an anonymous page dedicated to rating teachers. It looked harmless at first glance, filled with memes and jokes about cafeteria food and homework loads. Students followed it by the dozens, then the hundreds. Then came the post about Claire. A blurry photo, taken without her knowing, captured her mid-walk, hands full of papers, face serious. The caption read, "Queen of Rules, smile once and we'll give extra credit." The comments poured in, teasing, eye-rolling emojis, a few harsher jabs disguised as humor, and beneath it all that familiar tone, the idea that she existed to be critiqued, not respected. Claire found out when a student hesitated at the door and finally said, "Miss Bennett, I think you should see something." She scrolled through the page once, twice. Her heart sank, not because she felt humiliated, but because this was no longer confined to one hallway. Now it was public theater, and pain multiplied when audiences joined in. She set the phone down and inhaled deeply. This wasn't a battle she could fight by confronting a screen, nor could she let it fester in silence. That afternoon she changed the lesson plan. She began class with a story about a friend from years before, a talented athlete who quit her sport because anonymous comments convinced her she wasn't good enough. Claire didn't name the sport. She didn't mention Taekwondo. She simply described the emotional cost of anonymous cruelty and how easily it spreads when no one challenges it. Then she asked quietly, "What responsibility do we carry when we laugh at something that hurts someone else?" The room went still. Students shifted, uncomfortable, not because she scolded, but because she mirrored something back to them they couldn't unsee. A boy raised his hand. "It's just jokes, though." Claire nodded. "Sometimes it is, but sometimes jokes are used to make someone smaller, and when everyone joins in, that person feels alone." Silence. Then Rosa spoke. If you wouldn't say it to someone's face, maybe it's not as funny as you think. Claire let the class carry the discussion. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't mention the page directly. She simply created a space where empathy could breathe. Later that evening, Evan stared at the same page from his bedroom. He scrolled past the post he and Tyler had helped circulate. He saw the comments. For the first time, they didn't feel funny. They felt mean, cheap. He remembered the way Claire had looked earlier that day, steady, unbroken, and yet strangely human. He remembered that she had said, "Leadership is making space for others." He tossed the phone onto his bed, unsettled. The next morning, something unexpected happened. The post vanished. Then another message replaced it. Page shutting down, not cool anymore. Nobody admitted responsibility. Nobody apologized publicly. But Claire noticed the shift. The laughter surrounding her didn't vanish. It softened. Students met her eyes more. A few lingered after class to ask genuine questions. That afternoon, the assistant principal stopped by her classroom. "I heard about the page," he said quietly. "Thanks for how you handled it. You de-escalated something that could have blown up badly." Claire nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement but not seeking praise. "Kids mirror what they think earns respect," she said. "We have to show them another version." As the day ended, she walked the hallway with a steadier stride, not defiant, grounded. She noticed Evan watching her from a distance, curiosity in his eyes instead of mockery. She didn't hold his gaze long enough to challenge him. She simply nodded once, as if saying, "I still see you." On her drive home, Claire realized what had changed wasn't the danger. It still lingered, capable of tipping into something worse. What changed was the narrative. She was no longer the new teacher trying to survive. She was becoming a force in the building, not through authority, but through presence. And yet, storms often gather quietly before they break, because somewhere inside that school, resentment had begun hardening into resolve. Someone had decided silence didn't suit them anymore, and soon the test would no longer be about rumors or notes or anonymous pages. The next challenge would be direct, the kind that doesn't just question authority, it questions a person's right to stand where they stand. The first real cold snap arrived overnight. Frost traced thin white veins along the edges of windshields in the parking lot. Breath showed in the morning air, and inside the building, tension carried its own chill, harder to see, impossible to ignore. Claire sensed it as soon as she stepped through the front doors. Not outright hostility, not mockery, something heavier, a mood that felt like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. She greeted students by name, the way she always did. Some smiled back. Others nodded and moved quickly past her, trying not to get caught in whatever invisible line they believed existed between involved and safe. In third period, a strange silence settled into the room. The usual chatter before class didn't rise. Students sat with an edge to their stillness, the way people sit before bad news. Claire tried not to show that she noticed. She started the lesson. They were discussing difficult decisions in literature, moments where characters have to choose between comfort and conscience. Claire guided the conversation with gentle questions, giving students the space to wrestle with nuance. Then, midway through the discussion, Tyler spoke. "Sometimes," he said, leaning back casually, "people make everything a big deal because they want attention." The words hovered. They weren't overtly accusatory, but they carried a second meaning that everybody heard. A few students glanced at Claire. She didn't rush to respond. Instead, she asked, "What kind of attention do you think they want?" Tyler shrugged. "Power, sympathy, people feeling bad for them. Whatever." Claire nodded thoughtfully. "Or maybe," she said gently, "they just want to be treated with dignity. And when that doesn't happen, speaking up is the only way to remind the world they're human." A ripple went through the room. Not applause, not confrontation, just quiet recognition. Even Tyler dropped his gaze for a heartbeat, like the thought had slipped through his defenses before he could block it. The bell finally rang. Students filed out. Evan lingered in the doorway again, not saying anything, not moving. Just standing. Claire waited, giving him space. He opened his mouth, closed it, then muttered, "Never mind," and walked away. That afternoon, Claire had hallway duty again. The corridor pulsed with noise, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, laughter bouncing along the walls. She stood against the row, watchful but calm. Evan and Tyler approached from opposite ends of the hallway, not together this time. That, more than anything, made Claire uneasy. Tyler brushed past a smaller student, knocking his books to the floor. The boy crouched quickly, apologizing for an accident that hadn't been his. Claire stepped forward. "Tyler," she said, voice even, "help him pick those up." Tyler's jaw stiffened. He stared at her, the hallway quieted by degrees. Finally he bent, gathered the fallen notebooks, handed them back with forced politeness, then walked away with a sneer he didn't bother to hide. Evan watched from a distance. His expression wasn't mocking, it was complicated. Claire exhaled slowly. She wasn't trying to win, she was trying to teach. Still, she knew what had just happened. She disrupted the script. And when people lose their script, they often write a harsher one. That evening she graded essays at her dining table while the street lights glowed outside like watchful eyes. Many students wrote about morality as something abstract, but some, the ones who had lived more than they let on, wrote about it as something personal, something earned. She paused over one paper. The student had written, "Sometimes the bravest thing someone can do is not fight, but refuse to disappear." Claire closed her eyes. The words settled deep. Later she laced up her shoes and went for a slow walk. Movement helped her think. With each step, an old truth resurfaced. In every difficult conflict, there is the moment before impact. The brief space where everything still feels like it could calm down. She sensed she was standing in that space now. The question wasn't whether the storm would break. The question was what kind of person she would be when it did. The day the line truly snapped didn't begin dramatically. It began with fog resting low across the football field and the smell of wet leaves drifting through the open doors. It felt like any other day, which is how turning points usually disguise themselves. Claire's morning classes went smoothly. Students worked cooperatively. Questions flowed. For a little while she allowed herself to feel something close to hope. Progress doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet as steady breathing. Then came lunch. She walked the hallway toward the staff room, passing clusters of students leaning against lockers. Laughter rose and died in pockets. At first she didn't realize the laughter had anything to do with her. Not until she heard it. "Ask her, bet she'll freeze." A boy she didn't know stepped into her path, holding out a phone as if asking a normal question. "Ms. Bennett, what do you think about this?" On the screen was a video, shaky, secretly filmed during class. It had been edited to make her pauses look harsh, her words clipped mid-sentence to seem cold. Overlaid text read, "New teacher thinks she's better than everyone." Students nearby chuckled. Not all of them. Enough. Claire looked at the phone for one long breath, then at the faces around her. "Please put that away," she said calmly. The boy backed off, but the damage had already rippled. From the other end of the corridor, Tyler's voice boomed, "Come on, it's jokes." The crowd swelled, not violently, not aggressively, but it formed, watching, assessing. The moment turned into something else, a stage, and that was the danger. Claire felt the adrenaline rise again, the same unwelcome surge from weeks earlier. Her muscles tightened, instinctively reading exits, distances, possibilities. She had hated those instincts once. Now she understood they weren't about violence. They were about awareness, knowing when a situation was shifting from disrespect into something deeper. Evan appeared then, not beside Tyler but a little behind him. His jaw was tight. His eyes flicked between Claire, the crowd, and his friend. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then hesitated. Tyler took a step closer to Claire, not threatening, but too close to be respectful. "Lighten up," he said, echoing the note that had once been taped to her car. His voice was low, taunting, designed to test how far the world could bend. The hallway quieted, and in that suspended silence, Claire realized the truth she had been avoiding. This wasn't about jokes anymore. This was about establishing territory. Who sets the tone in this building? Whose voice matters? Whose dignity can be negotiated? She felt the decision crystallize inside her, calm, solid. She stepped slightly back, not retreating, simply reclaiming space. Then she spoke clearly enough for the circle to hear without raising her voice. "Respect is not optional in this hallway." It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a plea, it was a boundary. A line drawn not against a person but against behavior. A few students shifted. Someone whispered, "Uh-oh." Tyler let out a small laugh, masking discomfort. Or what? For a heartbeat, Claire heard the echo of her old instructor in her memory. "You don't prove strength by dominating. You prove it by refusing to surrender what is right." She didn't escalate. She didn't flinch. She held eye contact, steady, unshaken. "Or we address it," she said. "With adults. With accountability. Because everyone in this building deserves safety, including you." That last part landed differently. Unexpected. Disarming. Tyler blinked. Evan watched more closely now, expression unreadable. The assistant principal turned the corner then, drawn by the hush in the hallway. He took in the scene, the circle, the tension, the closeness. "What's going on?" he asked. Nobody answered. Claire didn't accuse. She simply explained evenly, "We're having a moment that needs boundaries." The administrator nodded, not taking sides but clearly recognizing the stakes. "All right," he said, "break it up. Get to lunch." The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly. Tyler moved last, muttering something under his breath that didn't quite reach open defiance. Evan followed. But as he passed Claire, he paused just long enough to say, barely audible, "This isn't over." He wasn't threatening. It sounded more like a warning, not to her, but to himself. When the hallway finally emptied, Claire leaned against the cool locker surface and allowed her shoulders to drop for a single second. Not relief, not fear, just acknowledgement. The midpoint had arrived, the place where things cannot go back to the way they were. She had drawn a clear line. The administration had seen it, the students had felt it, and now, the boys who once believed they controlled the rhythm of the school had discovered something unsettling. Their dominance was not inevitable. Walking back to her classroom, Claire knew one thing with absolute clarity. The story had shifted, and from this moment on, every choice, hers, theirs, the school's, would carry consequences that echoed far beyond one hallway. The next few days unfolded with an unsettling quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the silence that settles over a room right before a glass tips and shatters. Students walked with a new awareness, eyes flicking between teachers and the boys who once commanded attention by default. Claire noticed it first during morning attendance. Conversations hushed when she entered, not out of fear, but because something about the atmosphere had changed. Authority no longer felt like background noise, it felt present, aware, watching. But the quiet didn't mean surrender, it meant recalculations were happening. On Wednesday, a meeting invitation appeared in Claire's mailbox. A brief, polite note requesting she stop by the assistant principal's office after school. She recognized the tone immediately, professional, measured, the administrative way of saying, "We need to talk about what everyone saw." All day she carried that awareness with her like extra weight. She taught, she listened, she guided conversations, all while the deeper question hummed beneath everything. Had she done the right thing, or had she escalated something she could have ignored? In fourth period, Evan raised his hand. It surprised her enough that she paused mid-sentence. He asked a thoughtful question, not confrontational, not guarded, almost sincere. It led to a short back and forth about responsibility in literature, about how characters often become trapped in roles they no longer chose. When the class ended, Evan walked slowly to the door, then stopped. "Miss Bennett," he said without his usual swagger, "that hallway thing, you weren't trying to embarrass anyone. It wasn't a question." "No," she replied softly. "I was trying to draw a boundary." He nodded once, processing. "Boundaries feel like attacks when you're used to getting your way." Then he left. Her breath caught, not because he'd been clever, but because he had understood something most adults struggle to name. After school, she walked into the assistant principal's office prepared for criticism. Instead, she found measured support. "We've had complaints," he said, "and we've also had teachers thanking you. Parents are calling too, some upset, some relieved. What happened in that hallway exposed an issue we've been skirting around." Claire folded her hands in her lap. "Students deserve to feel safe, and so do staff." He nodded. "I agree, but we need to be deliberate. We're increasing supervision in key hallways. We're meeting with the boys involved. And I need you to document what you experience, clearly, calmly, factually. If this escalates, that record matters." Documentation, paper trails, the quiet, unglamorous tools of accountability. Claire agreed, not out of spite, but out of responsibility. That evening, she sat at her desk and wrote a factual account. Dates, times, behaviors, no embellishment. She felt strangely grounded doing it. Naming reality is a form of courage, too. Meanwhile, across town, Tyler sat at his kitchen table stewing. His mother scrolled through emails from the school, jaw tightening. He listened to every frustrated sigh. "You're not a bad kid," she said, "but you are making choices that have consequences." He hated that word, consequences, mostly because it was finally real. The next day at school, students sensed the shift. Staff positioned themselves more intentionally during passing periods. Conversations about respect cropped up in classrooms. The culture wasn't changing overnight, but it had been interrupted. During lunch, Claire noticed something subtle. A boy who normally walked with his head down straightened when she passed. A girl offered a shy smile, small acts, barely visible, but full of meaning. Because when someone draws a line with integrity, people learn lines are possible. Still, tension lingered. Late that afternoon, a locker slammed louder than necessary. A muttered comment snapped in the air. Then Claire heard it. "She thinks she's special now." The words weren't shouted. They were planted, designed to grow. She didn't turn around, not because she didn't care, but because sometimes dignity is refusing the invitation to wrestle in the mud. That night, she thought about every student who'd ever been on the receiving end of subtle cruelty. The kind that doesn't bruise skin, but bruises spirit. She remembered being younger, sitting on her own bed years ago, feeling smaller than she knew she should. And she understood finally and fully that the line she drew in that hallway wasn't only about her. It was about every quiet kid in this building learning what resilience looks like. Not retaliation, restraint with backbone. The official meeting with Evan and Tyler took place on a Thursday afternoon. They sat in chairs across from the assistant principal, hands folded, faces arranged into expressions of practiced neutrality. Claire was invited not as an adversary, but as someone whose experience mattered in the conversation. The assistant principal began with facts. No embellishments, no dramatics. He described school expectations, digital harassment concerns, hallway safety. He didn't label them bad. He didn't moralize. Then he asked a question that caught everyone off guard. Do you boys understand the influence you have? Tyler shrugged. Evan frowned slightly. You're looked up to, the administrator continued. That can become leadership or intimidation, sometimes both at once, and you may not realize when it crosses the line for others. Silence settled. Finally, Evan spoke. We were just messing around. Claire met his gaze. Sometimes messing around lands differently on someone carrying more weight than you can see. He didn't look away. That, in itself, mattered. The meeting ended with agreements. Clearer expectations, check-ins, consequences outlined calmly if behavior repeated. No theatrics, just structure. Walking out, Claire didn't feel victorious. She felt tired, but in the kind of way that comes after real work. Later, as students filtered out for the day, an unexpected encounter unfolded. The same smaller boy whose books had once been knocked from his hands stopped by her door. Thanks, he said awkwardly, for, not making it worse, but not pretending either. She nodded. You deserve respect. He smiled, embarrassed, and hurried away. Moments like that don't trend online. They don't generate hallway legends, but they build something longer lasting than fear, trust. Meanwhile, Tyler had begun to feel something new, exposure. He wasn't used to adults naming behaviors without anger. Anger was easy to fight. Calm accountability was harder. It left fewer excuses. In the locker room after practice, one teammate joked, "Careful, man. Ms. Bennett runs the place now." Everyone laughed. Tyler forced one too, but inside the joke stuck. It wasn't that she ran anything. It was that she hadn't broken, and something about that unsettled him. Evan noticed his friend's discomfort and didn't pile on. He sat quietly lacing his shoes, lost in thought. The hallway moment had cracked his certainty about strength. Strength had always meant control. Now he wasn't so sure. That weekend, Claire visited a small bookstore downtown. She wandered the aisles, letting her thoughts untangle. Bookshelves have a way of shifting perspective, reminding you that every struggle belongs to a wider human conversation. She picked up a memoir written by a former teacher who had worked in tough schools. A highlighted passage caught her eye. True authority is not the loudest voice in the room. It's the voice that refuses to disappear. She closed the cover gently, carrying the sentence with her like a quiet torch. Monday arrived with a different energy. Students approached Claire not as a target, but as someone whose presence balanced the room. Even those who disagreed respected the consistency. In class, they discussed characters who reached turning points, the moments when choices begin shaping identity. She didn't reference recent events. She didn't need to. The room buzzed with unspoken relevance. Rosa raised her hand. Sometimes, she said softly, the biggest battles are the ones no one applauds. The words hung in the air, universal, true, unmistakably connected to what the school had recently witnessed. After class, Evan lingered again. This time he didn't hesitate. I deleted the video, he said, and some other stuff. I'm not saying I did everything, but I was part of it. I figured it didn't help anything. Claire didn't praise him as if he were a child. She simply said, that took maturity. He shrugged, uncomfortable with approval. Doesn't change everything. No, she agreed, but it changes something. He nodded and left. For the rest of the day, Claire carried herself with quiet steadiness, not immune to stress, not untouchable, simply grounded. Because real resilience isn't about winning battles, it's about staying aligned with who you choose to be, even when the easier path is to shrink or explode. That night, as she turned off her classroom lights, the hallway reflected back a softer version of itself. Not solved, not perfect, but altered. The balance of power had begun to tilt, not toward domination, but toward accountability, awareness, and the uneasy promise that growth was possible. And somewhere deep inside the building, both boys felt it too. For one, it sparked reflection. For the other, it sparked resistance. The lingering belief that if he pushed hard enough, the old rules would return. The story was still moving forward, and the consequences, whatever shape they took next, would reveal more about everyone involved than any rumor or hallway spectacle ever could. Winter crept closer, and the mornings arrived darker. The building seemed to wake more slowly, as if even the walls were reluctant to face the cold. But inside those halls, something else had begun to thaw, the belief that nothing could ever change. Claire noticed it in small gestures first. Students held doors more often. The sarcastic applause that once followed discipline moments faded into attentive silence. Conversations turned slightly more thoughtful. And yet, under all of that, there was still tension. The fragile kind that forms when growth presses against habit. The administration rolled out a new initiative, restorative circles. Not punishments, not lectures, conversations, spaces where students could talk through harm, not to excuse it but to understand it. Some teachers rolled their eyes, others quietly welcomed the attempt. Claire volunteered to facilitate one, not because she wanted control, but because she understood how much power there is in letting people say the truth out loud. The circle included students from different grades, a mix of personalities. They sat with hesitant postures at first, as if the chairs themselves were judging. Claire set the tone. "This isn't about blame," she said. "It's about what happens to people when lines get crossed, and how we can do better next time." A boy spoke reluctantly about being teased for his clothes. A girl shared how rumors had chased her for months. The room absorbed the stories like a sponge, heavy yet strangely cleansing. Then, unexpectedly, Evan cleared his throat. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you don't realize you're hurting someone because the crowd makes it feel normal." Nobody laughed, nobody rolled their eyes. The honesty landed like a seed. Claire felt something shift. Not redemption, not absolution. Awareness. The kind of awareness that takes root slowly, changing future decisions without needing applause. Later that week, however, the pushback arrived. Tyler had grown quieter since the hallway incident, but not calmer. The quiet felt coiled, like tension wrapped tight. He'd begun skipping assignments, muttering comments just under his breath, tugging at boundaries like they were strings he could eventually snap. One afternoon in the middle of class, he dropped his chair back intentionally and laughed when the sudden noise startled others. Claire approached him not with anger, but with presence. "Take a walk with me," she said. The class watched in stunned silence as they stepped into the hallway. They stood several feet apart, not blocking exits, not making theater of it. "I'm not here to punish you," she said gently. "I'm trying to understand what's happening beneath all of this." He smirked automatically, then faltered, as if the script he expected wasn't available anymore. "I don't like being made to look stupid," he muttered. "You're not stupid," Claire replied, "but when you try to control a room, it tells me you're afraid of losing something." He looked away. His jaw worked. "You don't get it." "Maybe not," she said, "but I'm willing to listen if you ever decide to talk." He scoffed, then walked back into the classroom with a posture that suggested unresolved tension rather than victory. Claire returned to teaching, aware that growth rarely travels in straight lines. Sometimes it loops back, circles, resists. That evening she reviewed documentation again, not because she wanted ammunition, but because clarity protects fairness. Her notes remained factual, steady, unemotional. She wasn't waiting for someone to fail. She was holding the truth still long enough for the adults around her to see it all at once. At home, she made tea and stood by the window, watching the city lights blink in the distance. She remembered her early training, long hours learning not just kicks and forms, but stillness, breath, patience. Her instructor had once told her, "Real power isn't the ability to strike, it's the ability to stand without losing yourself." Those words returned now, carrying new meaning. She wasn't just standing for herself anymore, she was standing for a culture in which dignity wasn't negotiable. The next morning, a quiet moment surprised her. In the hallway, a group of students walked by. A tall girl nodded respectfully and said softly, "Morning, Miss Bennett. Just 2 words, but tone matters." Respect had begun to replace fear. And with respect comes responsibility, for everyone including her, because the closer they came to real change, the more fragile things felt. Old habits rarely release control without a final struggle. The struggle arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, not loud, not explosive, but heavy enough to change the emotional weather of the school. The announcement crackled over the intercom. "Staff and students, please remain in your classrooms until further notice. We're handling a situation." A ripple of whispers surged through Claire's room. She lifted her hand gently. "We stay calm," she said. "We stay respectful. We wait." Minutes passed. The hallway remained unnaturally quiet. Somewhere distant, footsteps echoed, the measured cadence of administrators and security moving with purpose. Claire kept teaching, but slowly, thoughtfully shifting the discussion toward resilience. How characters in their novel adapted when control slipped from their hands. The topic didn't feel theoretical anymore. 20 minutes later, the all-clear sounded. Students exhaled as if releasing a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. After dismissal, the assistant principal stopped by. His expression carried a blend of relief and fatigue. "We had a confrontation outside the cafeteria," he said. "It could have gone bad. It didn't." He hesitated. One of the boys stepped in, de-escalated instead of fueling it. Claire didn't need to ask which boy, she already knew. That evening, Evan appeared at her doorway after school, hands shoved into his pockets. "I'm not saying I'm some hero," he said, eyes lowered. "But I remembered what you said, about boundaries being for everyone, so I told them to chill." Claire nodded, warmth flooding her chest. "That's leadership," he shrugged. Felt weird, but also better. He left before she could respond further, as if afraid of what vulnerability might reveal. Across the building, however, another conversation was happening. Tyler sat in the assistant principal's office, arms crossed, fury simmering beneath the surface. He hadn't been involved in the cafeteria incident, but he heard what people were saying afterward. Evan handled it. Evan stepped up. Evan changed. The spotlight that had once belonged to defiance had shifted toward maturity, and Tyler resented the shift intensely. He walked out of the office with jaw set, convinced the world had turned unfair. That evening he messaged a few friends, floating ideas about reminding people how things worked. Not threats, not plans, just seeds. Seeds that, in the wrong conditions, grow quickly. Meanwhile, Claire ended her day differently. She returned to the community center, stepping into the quiet training room. The instructor greeted her with a knowing smile. "Hard week? Important week," Claire answered. They practiced slow forms, controlled intentional movements that anchored breath and posture. With every shift of weight, Claire remembered who she was beyond the job, a person shaped by discipline, by compassion, by the stubborn belief that respect could be taught without humiliation. Driving home, she felt something close to peace, not because everything was fixed, but because the path forward felt clearer. The next morning, the whispers returned, but this time they sounded different, not mocking, curious, reflective. Students were talking about the cafeteria moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was surprising. Someone had chosen calm, and people noticed. During class, Claire guided a discussion about moral courage, the subtle kind that rarely makes headlines. Students drew connections she hadn't even anticipated. Rosa raised her hand again. Sometimes growth doesn't look like changing the world. Sometimes it looks like changing what you do the next time something happens. Several students nodded. Even Tyler stared at his desk, expression tight. After the bell, he lingered. The room emptied. He finally spoke, voice low and brittle. Everyone acts like he's some kind of saint now. Claire didn't defend Evan. She didn't inflame Tyler. She simply said, "People notice when someone chooses differently. That doesn't erase the past. It just opens a new door." He swallowed, saying nothing. Then he left. That night, Claire added another entry to her documentation, not to build a case, but to keep the narrative honest. Positive shifts matter just as much as harmful ones. She ended the day sitting at her kitchen table, palms resting flat, breathing slowly. The turning point had passed. The ripple effects were here. Power was no longer concentrated in fear or intimidation. It was dispersing, moving toward shared respect, toward accountability, toward a community that was just beginning, to believe in different possibilities. And yet, as she prepared for sleep, a faint unease lingered, because growth isn't linear, and those who feel their grip slipping sometimes reach for it one last time, not out of cruelty alone, but out of fear of what comes next when they are no longer the center of gravity. Tomorrow, she sensed, would test not just the students. The morning that followed arrived with a brittle kind of brightness, sun pouring through the classroom windows, sharp and clear, as if trying to insist on optimism. But beneath the golden light there was an uneasiness Claire couldn't quite name. The school felt alert, watchful. Rumors drifted like dust motes through the hallways. Nothing concrete, just fragments. Something's going down. They're planning something. Don't sit near the back tables. Students had a way of sensing shifts before adults did, like animals before a storm. Claire moved through her lessons with intention, grounding the room in routine and quiet stability. She reminded students gently, "We treat each other like human beings. That's our baseline." Heads nodded, pens moved. The atmosphere inside her classroom felt steady. But steadiness, she knew, could be fragile when pressure pressed too hard from the outside. During lunch, she took a brief walk through the corridor. She noticed Tyler by the vending machines, shoulders rigid, voice low as he spoke to two boys from another grade. They glanced over at her, then looked away quickly. Nothing explicit, nothing actionable, but something unresolved simmered there. The resentment of someone who felt the world had shifted without his permission. She didn't confront, not yet, she simply observed. Awareness wasn't suspicion, it was preparation. That afternoon, the principal called a brief staff meeting. More supervision, more presence. Clear messaging about safety and respect. Claire listened, appreciating the firm but calm tone. This was the steady work institutions often avoided because it lacked drama. But it mattered. Back in her classroom, something unexpectedly tender unfolded. Rosa stayed behind after the bell, fidgeting with her backpack strap. "Miss Bennett?" "Yes?" Rosa hesitated. "I just wanted to say, before this year I thought teachers didn't notice things, or didn't care. But you see stuff. And you don't yell. You just fix it." Claire's throat tightened. "I don't always get it right," she said honestly. "But I try to make sure nobody feels invisible." Rosa nodded, eyes shining a little. "That matters." When the girl left, the room felt fuller somehow, as if kindness had weight. But even as gratitude settled into her chest, Claire sensed an approaching test she couldn't quite define. Growth had been planted, but resistance hadn't fully given up. Real change always asks one final question. How deep does this commitment go when it costs something? She wondered, not with fear but with quiet curiosity. Whether the school, the students, and even she herself could answer that question honestly when the moment finally arrived. And something in her spirit knew that moment was closer than anyone realized. It happened at the end of a long day, the kind of day where everyone was tired, the hallways humming with restless noise. Last period had just ended. Backpacks slammed, voices rose. Claire walked into the hallway and saw it unfold within seconds. A smaller freshman had been cornered near the lockers. trapped between two boys who stood just close enough to invade space, but not close enough to look openly aggressive. Their tone was teasing, but the boy's eyes told a different story. He wasn't laughing, he was shrinking. Tyler stood a few feet away, watching, not participating, not stopping it either. His expression was hard to read. Frustration, pride, something like defiance simmering. The crowd instinctively began to form, curious, detached, willing to witness rather than intervene. Claire stepped forward, her voice steady. "Hey, back up! Give him room!" The boys turned with easy smirks, the kind that said they'd been expecting soft resistance, but her presence landed differently than before. Not angry, not pleading, grounded. "We're just joking," one said. "Then you can joke without cornering someone," she replied. "Step aside." They hesitated, then shifted just enough for the freshman to slip away. He hurried past, whispering a small thank you. The tension loosened, but not completely. The crowd didn't disperse. Instead, all eyes drifted toward Tyler, and in that instant, the real conflict revealed itself. It wasn't about the freshman. It wasn't even about the hallway. It was about who decided what strength meant here. Tyler took a slow step forward, meeting Claire's gaze. His voice was controlled, quiet enough that only those closest could hear, but every ear strained to catch it. "You think you changed everything?" She didn't answer with superiority. She answered with honesty. "No, I think we're trying to grow, all of us, even you." His expression flickered, then tightened. "I don't need fixing. I'm not trying to fix you," she said gently. "I'm trying to keep people safe, including you. You carry more weight than you realize. What you do gives other people permission." That landed, not like an accusation, but like a mirror. For just a heartbeat, his posture softened. Vulnerability cracked through the armor. Then someone from the crowd whispered, "Back down, man." The old script tugged at him. Pride pulled hard, his fists clenched, not for violence but for control. Years of learned expectations battled with the newer, quieter truth pressing its way in, and right there, in that charged, precarious pause, Evan stepped beside him. Not confrontational, not dramatic, simply present. "She's right," Evan said quietly. "This isn't who we want to be remembered as." The hallway stilled. This wasn't rebellion, it was choice. Tyler looked at his friend, really looked, and something shifted. Not defeated, not humiliated, simply disarmed. He exhaled, shoulders dropped. "Whatever," he muttered, but the edge had softened. He turned away. The crowd dissolved, unsure how to feed on a moment that refused to explode. Claire didn't claim victory. She simply nodded once to both boys, honoring the restraint rather than the conflict. Later that afternoon, the assistant principal called her into his office, not for reprimand, but for reflection. "We watched something important today," he said, "not because it avoided trouble, but because it showed this building another version of strength." Claire sat quietly, hands folded, absorbing the weight of the moment, not triumph, responsibility. That evening she returned to the quiet gym at the community center. She moved through slow forms, breath steady, posture aligned. She wasn't training to fight. She was training to stay whole. And as she bowed at the end, a gesture of gratitude to the discipline that had shaped her, she realized the journey had never been about Taekwondo versus Bullies. It had been about dignity, consistency, and the courage to believe people can change without being publicly broken. Spring arrived gradually, like a promise whispered instead of announced. Trees outside the school softened into color. Windows opened more often. Laughter returned to the hallways, lighter now, less edged. The culture hadn't transformed overnight, schools rarely do, but something undeniable had shifted. Students began self-correcting small cruelties. Staff modeled accountability with clarity instead of fear. And the hallway where everything once felt fragile slowly became a place where people moved with less tension in their shoulders. Claire continued teaching, not as a legend, not as the new teacher who fought the bullies, but as someone reliable, grounded, present. One afternoon near the end of the year, she found herself standing by the lockers where it had all begun. She heard footsteps and turned. Evan approached, taller somehow, quieter in a way that suggested growth rather than withdrawal. "I got into a community mentoring program," he said. "Figured, if I've got influence, I should use it right." Her smile wasn't exaggerated, it was warm and real. "That sounds like leadership," he nodded. "And thanks. Not for letting me off easy, for not giving up." He walked away before emotion could linger too long, his way of keeping dignity intact. Moments later, Tyler appeared. He didn't swagger, he didn't avoid eye contact. He simply leaned against a locker, hesitated, then said, "I'm still figuring stuff out." "So am I," Claire admitted. He let out a breath, something like relief. "Sorry for most of it." "Apology accepted," she said. "Growth isn't a straight line." He nodded and left, not redeemed in some dramatic sweep, but walking, step by step, toward something quieter and sturdier than control. That evening, Claire locked her classroom for the day and paused in the doorway, listening to the faint echo of distant laughter. The school didn't feel perfect. It felt human, and that was enough. On her drive home, she reflected not on victory, but on the subtle truth that had emerged over the months. Strength doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it looks like showing up, holding boundaries, offering dignity even when you aren't receiving it. And resilience, real resilience, isn't the refusal to break. It's the decision, again and again, to bend toward what is right. She parked outside her apartment, sat for a moment in the quiet, and let gratitude settle into her chest. Gratitude for students learning to choose better, for colleagues willing to try new approaches, for the strange, patient work of helping a community grow. She whispered softly, not as a speech, but as a personal truth, respect isn't enforced, it's modeled. The story didn't end with fireworks, it ended the way real life often does, with people slightly better than they once were, aware of the weight their choices carry, and still imperfect enough to keep trying. And somewhere in a school hallway filled with ordinary footsteps, a quiet message lingered: we are capable of more than our worst moments. We are capable of learning how to treat each other better, if we're willing to stay and do the work, even when nobody is cheering. Thank you for staying with this story. Sometimes narratives like this aren't loud, but they're real, and they shape the spaces we all share. Before you go, here's something I'd genuinely like to know. From which part of the country are you watching this story? But the very idea of what strength truly means in a place where everyone is still learning how to treat one another.